Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. I have a leather jacket on today because my shirt is going to be distracting. It makes me look like the Invisible Man. I have green tie-dye shirt on that my youngest daughter, Sydney, made for me, and I love wearing it, but I should never wear it on show days because it's too distracting. We have a really good show planned for today. We're going to be talking about fiber. I have some strong opinions about fiber that I've talked about over the years. If you are a longtime listener, you know that. But we're going to get into another area of fiber, and that is with gut inflammation and things like irritable bowel. Is there a place for fiber in those diets? And I've got lots of questions, so I'm sure that we're going to take this in a lot of different directions. So it should be interesting. I have to thank our title sponsor first, and that's Legendary Foods, makers of the Tasty Pastry. The Tasty Pastry was a version of the Pop-Tart reimagined, less than 1 gram of sugar, 20 grams of high-quality protein, dairy protein, and 4 to 5 net carbs. And it tastes like real pastry. I mean, you don't have to gag it down just because it fits the macros of your particular diet. And now the genius of the team at Legendary Foods has come up with a new product that they're launching, and we'll have some graphics of it very shortly, called the Sweet Rolls. They come in cinnamon, chocolate, and berry. The cinnamon one is just like a Cinnabon at the airport. I mean, it's gooey and it's soft and it's delicious. Again, 1 gram of sugar, 4 to 5 net carbs, 20 grams of protein. Trust me, these are so delicious that your children will eat them. And it's hard to get your children to eat a healthy snack of any type, let's be honest. But these are a game changer. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off. That also lets them know that you learned about them here at Superhuman Radio. And now, without further delay, I will bring my guests on. My shirt is distracting. I see it's still peeking through. But hey, that's the way it is. Dr. Eytan and Dr. Heather Armstrong, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Good.
Thanks.
Why this study? What preceded this work that made this the next logical thing to look at in the scope of what you were looking for in endpoints?
I guess I can take this one away. So one of the reasons why we were really interested in looking into this, obviously dietary fibers can be included in that prebiotic term that we typically hear mulling around. But so one really interesting thing to keep in mind is a lot of patients with digestive issues, and in particular inflammatory bowel diseases, will actually tell us that they really struggle to consume a high fiber diet. And so we really wanted to understand why that's happening. I think it's really important, since in a clinical setting, if you don't know why something's happening, you're not necessarily going to give patients the best advice. So we found some prior studies suggesting that in response to fungal infections in the body, there's actually these carbohydrate structures on the outside of a fungal cell that our immune system will attach to be able to clear that infection, which is fantastic if you're dealing with a fungal infection. But obviously in a dietary setting, if those fibers are passing through the body and they're not being broken down or fermented by our gut microbes, this is a process that's required for a breakdown of dietary fibers. They're not actually digested in our body. And so if you don't have the right microbes in your gut to ferment those dietary fibers, we thought, hey, maybe if those fibers aren't being broken down, you can actually have this same inflammatory response that you would see for this fungal clearing a situation that you see in a fungal infection. And so that's kind of where the study started.
Maybe Carl.
So how was this study?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Go.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as a physician who treats. So I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. I treat children with inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. And certainly, there's been a lot of interest in diet, but we always had a very clear thought about fiber. We thought fiber is good for you. And the only scenario where we felt that fiber may not be good is if you have an obstruction. So if you have an area of narrowing in your bowel, then fiber, which may not be fully digested, can cause obstructive symptoms. But otherwise, we were encouraging patients. And last year, I was fortunate to be involved in writing guidelines on nutrition from the International Organization for the Study of IBD. And the area I was asked to focus on was fiber, fruits and vegetables. And the science that we have was quite conclusive that these are good for you. And I'm sure everyone knows the benefits of fiber. But then, Heather, with the experience that she just described, but also research in patients, suggests that there's a huge disconnect between what we believe in the medical scientific world is the right way to go and what patients are actually doing. And surveys published across the world again and again show that, patients who have a flare of their symptoms, one of the first things they'll do is avoid fruits, vegetables, and fiber sources. And we did not know why. And that's where this came from. So it really was a patient-driven need, plus the science that Heather described that kind of led to this project.
From an evolutionary perspective, fiber was a roadblock for us. When we started eating less fibrous foods, plants and roots and even tubers, and we started to eat more nutrient-dense foods like meat, animal flesh, that is when the gut, through evolution, became smaller because you don't need as large of a factory to try to extract as much nutrition out of these plant sources that tend to have higher fiber. We saw this in the transition between Australopithecus robustus and Australopithecus gracile, or Africanus. Africanus tended to eat more meat, and their gut got smaller, their brain got bigger. Dr. Leslie Aiello, who used to be the head of the Wenner-Gren Foundation in Manhattan, wrote an article that went around the internet, got viral, about eating more meat made our brains bigger. It was a matter of resources. Our body didn't have to work so hard. The gut got smaller, and the brain had more resource at its availability, and it grew. And that made me start thinking about fiber differently. From an evolutionary perspective, fiber was not a good thing because we had to spend most of our day gathering food and eating it. And fiber slows gastric emptying, which means that we made it harder for us. It changed digestive motility and prokinesis, and it made it harder for us to eat enough in a day when your body has worked so hard to break down. And fiber becoming healthy for us is a relatively new paradigm, because now we want to slow gastric emptying because people are becoming diabetic and blood sugar is rising so quickly. So it really, fiber has not been our friend until we became metabolically broken. Would either of you speak on that idea? I mean, this is my own idea. It's not something that I've found in the literature, but
I think one of the most
fiber's importance.
I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is
we're having some internet challenge. Could you start again, please, Heather?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the really important things to keep in mind is kind of how I mentioned, we don't digest fibers ourselves. It's actually the microbes in our gut that break them down and ferment them. But that process is essential not only for the health of our gut and the energy sources that provides to the cells in the gut, but it's also really important for a series of microbiota health. And we know that the gut microbiome is involved in a variety of different diseases. So if you're not feeding your gut microbes the fibers that they need as their own food source, then you can drive changes in the gut microbiome that can actually cause disease and worsen disease. So we know that fibers are healthy from that perspective. Obviously, it's always in balance, but it's really important to be mindful of the fact that this is a food source for your microbiota, and to keep them happy and healthy is to keep us happy and healthy as well. But some of the byproducts that they produce in that fermentation process are really essential for anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body. So that's production of short-chain fatty acids from fermentation of dietary fibers. Those short-chain fatty acids are taken up in the bloodstream and can cause anti-inflammatory effects on a number of diseases, as well as your basic human and host health. So it's a very complex situation. Obviously, it's not as simple as just eat fibers and it's all well and good. There are actually a bunch of different chemical structures that are together called fiber. And so ultimately, there are actually a lot of different types of dietary fiber, and we're really trying to understand which ones are important for health, which ones are just present in foods and maybe not quite so important. But what do each of these fibers do? How do they interact with the microbiota? How do they interact with the host? And so how can we actually identify which foods, which fibers are actually beneficial for health and which are kind of just fluff?
Yeah, and that was going to be one of my questions. You know, there are a lot of different types of fibers, and it becomes even more complicated when we start to do things to promote digestion-resistant starches. Like, you know, if you bake a potato, put it in the refrigerator, and then reheat it and eat it, it becomes a higher degree of digestion-resistant starch, which a lot of people do purposefully. So, are there some fibers that are playing out to say? And how do we know which classification? Soluble, insoluble. Glucomannan has been a very popular fiber for people who want to change the diversity of their gut microbiome. Do we know that there are some fibers and some bad ones?
I don't know, Eytan, you want to give this
Yeah,
one?
I can take first stab at that. So yeah, definitely. And, you know, again, as a clinician who had a very simplistic understanding of fiber in the past, I have learned a ton over the last few years. And I realize how little we really know about the biological effect of these different fibers. So it's much easier for us to think in a dichotomous way, right? You know, fiber, no fiber, soluble, non-soluble. But, you know, the main three features of fibers that people will usually quote are the solubility, the fermentation, and then the viscosity that they create. And, you know, like one of the most common conditions that I treat as a gastroenterologist is constipation, where we will use fiber to change the consistency of our stool, but we also use it for diarrhea, right? So sometimes it really is just that those chemical features that we're interested in. But what we're starting to learn more and more is the actual biological value of fiber, which translates to the byproducts that bacteria will produce when they ferment the fiber. And that's where the devil is in the details. And I think what our study shows is that certainly, you know, the fiber that you eat is important, but the bacteria that you have on the receiving end is just as important. And that's something that we really haven't considered well enough in the past. And this really leads to an area that we have a lot of interest now, which is personalized diets. And they're certainly, we're not, you know, the first ones to come up with this, but the understanding that what you eat very much depends on the factory inside that is there to disassemble, reassemble, and, you know, really the metabolism in general, and that microbes, not only bacteria, microbes in general, have a major role in that. So we have to take those two components together when we're looking at a clinical effect, nutritional effect, health-related effect of different fibers. Now, certainly, you know, we can start going through a list of fibers and identifying what potentially would work for you, for me, or for Heather in one way or another. But what we're hoping to add is the bacteria in there that are involved in processing that. So you asked a complex question, and I've learned again and again that, you know, answering a question is frequently best addressed by asking another one, right? So what are your bacteria like? And I think that just presenting the complexity is the direction I'd like to take this in.
Yeah, and that's my questions. Now we're getting better. I don't think we fully understand, but we're getting better at mapping the microbes that inhabit a person today. We've got several companies that will do stool testing by what's leaving the body. Some are actually doing some other approaches. So can we first of all, is it even important to map the microbes when microbial diversity can literally shift in 2 days depending on how you change your diet? We've seen this in carnivore, we've seen this in ketogenic diets. We literally see these microbes go into suspended animation that were causing problems for people. They don't seem to disappear. You can't kill them. They just are really good at sporing, and next time you eat that food, they wake back up. But since we are mapping the microbiome, can people reliably go, oh, this is the way my microbiome is, I have to eat this way? Or do they just eliminate the foods that seem to be stimulating the unwanted effects of their microbiome?
I think it's a very complex question. So what our study actually found is it's not even about which microbes are present, but kind of something that you almost just touched on there is you can have the exact same microbes present in yourself and myself, but if my microbes aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're not producing the correct enzymes, they're not interacting with these dietary factors the same way your exact same microbes are. So it's that functionality of the microbes that can be really important too. And I think that that's something that the field has only very recently started to focus on. So not just about which microbes are there and how many of them, but also about what are they actually doing. So I think that's something that's quite novel, is that the field is starting to look at how microbes are actually functioning. And exactly like you said, I mean, so when you wake up in the morning and you haven't eaten anything yet, your microbiome looks completely different to how it's going to look that afternoon after you've eaten certain foods, you've drank certain water, you've maybe exercised, or you've had a stressful day. All of these things are going to influence your microbiome. But on average, it takes about 2 weeks to have a pretty significant change in the totality of your microbiota and what it's capable of doing.
Right.
And it is a little bit of chicken and the egg here.
Go ahead.
Because what you eat affects your microbes, and then that will affect what they're able to do to the food that you eat. So you touched on, Carl, very correctly, the almost immediate effect of certain foods, but the fact that there is a bit of a core microbiome that seems to remain there. So one of the things that we did look at, for example, is previous diet and how that relates to the immune response that you have to certain fibers. And we did find a correlation there. Now, part of this might be behavioral. So, people are avoiding certain foods because they're causing symptoms. But at the same time, what you eat does shape your microbiome over time. And there have been several studies showing that. So, like making a change is really, a moving target. So we know what we want to do, but it's constantly changing. And I think our ability to understand that with our very mighty and strong human brain is still quite limited. And in medicine, it's certainly true. We know what a target blood pressure is. We know what a target hemoglobin and blood glucose is. But what a target microbiome is much more difficult to define, because it's the hundreds, if not 1,000 different types of microbes, but it's the millions of different functions that they have and genes that they hold. And we use different bioinformatic techniques to try and distill the ones that are most important. And we do have that in our paper, but that is, looking at only a very small piece of the data that we have. And this is where I think, we'll need computers and other ways to better understand this over time, which is very frustrating, because I like to understand what I'm doing, and I like to know I should be working out and doing this, that, or whatever with a specific target, and not a computer saying to me, now you need to have, a noon rest and wake up in 3 hours and eat lettuce or whatever. Right. So we're going to have to adjust in the way we think. And I don't know what that's going to look like.
So I have one other question, and then I want to delve into the research. Can we learn anything from people who are on low residue diets, perhaps for gastric bypass, where they're not eating fiber foods. They can't really handle the bulk production. And then we look at them, and because, one would think somebody who's on a low fiber diet because of bypass surgery, for instance, that they should become deficient in things. Now, we know that they do become deficient in some vitamins and nutrients, but do we see any signatures in those people because they're eating virtually no fiber for the rest of their lives?
So I don't think I've seen a study looking at that specifically. That's a wonderful idea, Carl. I think we can learn a lot from that. However, there always is a however. That type of research, human diet research, is extremely difficult to conduct in a systematic way. And I'll go back to, simple examples. If we're looking at exposures, like cigarette smoking, I can quantify how much a person smokes very easily, and then translate it to pack years or whatever. But diet is so much more complex. And obviously, fiber is an important component. That's what we're focusing on today. But when you eat something, usually it's replacing something else that you're not eating. And if you're looking at the effect, is it what I'm taking more of or what I'm taking less of? And besides that, you may say that you're eating something, but are you really? And if you ask, it's not that people are lying, but I think we're not very good at assessing. So we do have different tools for that. And, at the research side, we have, for example, food frequency questionnaire and dietary diaries that dietitians have been very helpful in using clinically. But on the research side, it doesn't always completely translate. And like that's a great idea. And I think that we would get information from research like that, but we always have to remember the caveats of any research that's done in that setting.
Yeah, because the diaries are not reliable because people over-report what they perceive as good behavior and under-report what they perceive as bad behavior. And what's good behavior and bad behavior changes over time. Now all of a sudden we're back to red meat is good and eggs are good. So, it's a moving target, right? All right, let's talk about the research. So how was the research designed for this study?
Sure. So we took a pretty multifactorial approach to the entire study. So obviously we recognize that the microbes are important, the host is important, and the source of the dietary fibers is really important. So what we did is during colonoscopy, when patients are coming in, they're either diagnosed or already have inflammatory bowel disease, or they'll be coming in without IBD, but for a variety of other reasons. They may just be having screening done, or they may have functional disorders instead. And so that's kind of how we grabbed this IBD cohort and this non-IBD cohort of patients. And during that colonoscopy, they'll have biopsies collected, they'll have gut microbes collected, and then we can take all of those samples back into the lab and use a variety of different culturing techniques to look at how do the microbes interact with these different fibers. Are they capable of fermenting them if those microbes came from a patient who has remission IBD, active disease, more severe active disease, or if they don't have IBD at all? And so what we were able to show is that particularly those IBD patients with more severe disease, which obviously means more gut damage and massive changes to the microenvironment of the gut, those patients were least capable of fermenting these specific fibers. We found it was beta fructans, which are actually touted as a prebiotic. Those were the fibers that were difficult to ferment. But if those beta fructans weren't broken down when you took that fiber and treated the biopsies from those patients with that fiber, it was, again, those patients with inflammatory bowel disease that really had this significant inflammatory response. And that's kind of an indicator of progressive gut damage. So in a patient that already has gut damage, to worsen that even further suggests why this sensitivity to eating these dietary fibers could actually be worsened. So the beta fructans are found in things like artichoke, asparagus, garlic, onions, bananas. Each fiber type is found in different volumes in different foods, but that's where you typically find your beta fructans. And so in trying to understand, how does the source of that fiber actually matter? How does that interaction happen with the microbes in that individual patient? And then what happens if those fibers engage with those biopsies or those gut tissues? What are we actually seeing? That's kind of how we approached the study.
You know, it's interesting. When probiotics became a thing, I would say probably maybe 13 years ago or so. I did a show on a something called cowboy soup. It was either from New Zealand or Australia, and it was a soup made with leeks and onions and some other vegetables that are now we know are super prebiotics. And it was compared to an oral probiotic. One group ate the soup every day, one group took the pill every day, and then they assessed, and the soup worked better at populating the gut with this particular than a, and you know, and we always want to know what's the one thing. I just want to take the one thing that work, and we forget about the entourage effect, and we forget about the evolution of plants, and we forget about our interactions with them for millions of years. And it turns out that a lot of times the things that work the best are food sources. Kimchi is real popular now with, you know, average people. Sauerkraut is becoming popular again. I opened the can the other day, and my wife Elisa wanted to run out of the house, and I had to eat it fast. But you know, there's a lot to be said for the diet promoting the microbes that then do good things with the fiber.
Yeah, I think that comes back to kind of what we talked about earlier, where even if you've kind of reduced the abundance of those microbes, they're not necessarily gone. So if you give them back their food source, you might call it negative on one side where, yeah, you could eat the wrong things and you're really promoting growth of the wrong microbes. But in this case, if you're sending them these dietary fibers that they need for their own survival, you're going to promote those good and healthy microbes. But what we're really trying to understand is who is that most important for, which prebiotics and which fibers are safe for which people. Obviously, when you know that beta-fructan fibers being one of the top spoken about prebiotics are really beneficial in healthy individuals, really honestly beneficial in a big number of inflammatory bowel disease patients and other disease settings. But there's this subset of patients where you can feed them this prebiotic fiber and they just don't have the right microbes in place because of their disease and all of this damage that they already have in their body. And so you're not going to get the benefits. You're kind of shoving this fiber in there, and it's actually nothing's happening. The microbes aren't fermenting it, and so it's causing this interaction with the host that it wouldn't normally cause in a healthy setting. So really trying to understand, you know, okay, to these individuals, these are the prebiotics we should be promoting because they're very beneficial, very healthy, anti-inflammatory, prevent a lot of diseases. But in this particular subgroup of people who are missing either these particular microbes or these microbial functions, we shouldn't be forcing them to eat fiber XY.
Right.
We should be using fiber Z instead. So that's kind of where we're trying to focus right now.
Maybe, Carl, if I can just
do you have anything, Dr. Wine?
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yeah, so I think what we're noticing is that I discussed about the avoidance, fiber avoidance, and you know, elimination diets, which have become very popular and sometimes medically prescribed, and that's one of the risks. You know, when a patient either has symptoms or if they hear our talk now and they say, "Oh, fiber can be bad," what we don't want to happen is what's happening in many cases is, and that's that they're completely eliminating fibers. So fiber can and is good for you. But we just want to eliminate the right ones at the right timing. And in a way, what we found was that this is a very specific scenario. And the last thing I want is listeners to kind of leave this with the impression that fiber is bad. Fiber is good, but under certain circumstances, if there's a perfect storm that I'll describe in a sec, then it can be bad. And that's what we need to try and identify. And that perfect storm is, so as Heather said, having the wrong bacteria, or more precisely, not having the right bacteria, so the ones that can ferment, having a breakdown of your intestinal barrier. So, you know, if your gut is intact, then the fiber itself would not come in contact with your immune cells. And food typically does not induce an immune response in most individuals. And then having a lot of immune cells in the area, which is exactly what happens when you have active IBD. So you have the barrier breakdown, immune infiltration, and then that interaction can happen. And we did show specifically that it's macrophages that are driving a lot of this. And we went into some of the specific pathways, immune pathways involved. But for most of us, it's really not relevant. And a lot of people who do have fiber sensitivity, that's from a very different mechanism and process. So, lots of patients, you mentioned IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which is different from IBD. Lots of people have fiber sensitivity there, which is related more to production of gas and motility.
Right.
So that's very different. Just important to clarify.
And different fibers.
Yeah, no,
too,
no.
which is really interesting.
Yeah, no, you know what's funny? I just reintroduced oatmeal, which has beta glucan, right? That's a beta source. I just reintroduced oatmeal 2 weeks ago, and I'm dealing with constipation. And I said to my wife this morning, I think I got to back the oatmeal back out because for some reason it's not working for me. And I want to talk about microbes when we come back because you really can't talk about fiber. You can't talk about ham sandwiches without talking about bread. You know what I mean? And you can't really talk about fiber without talking about these microbes, because if they don't play nicely with the microbes, that's where the problems become. And so I want to talk about how what should people pay attention to? It's easy to introduce and reduce certain foods in the diet. What should they be looking for? I got a lot more questions that everyone should find interesting. So let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Superhuman Radio. Stick with us. Stick with us. P3OM from Bioptimizers is a patented prebiotic and probiotic supplement with Lactobacillus plantarum OM. It has now been upgraded to P3OM 2.0 with the addition of a superfood formulation that makes it 2 times stronger, as well as optimizes L. plantarum's strength. So it's more powerful than ever, which means that not only will it help you completely digest all animal proteins, it also reduces cortisol, causes deep relaxation and better sleep, and reduces stress. Go to shrnetwork.biz/P3-OM today and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off. Remember those rectangular toaster pastries you used to love when you were a kid? Well, Legendary Foods has just made them better. The new cake-style tasty pastry is like nothing you've ever had before. With 20 grams of high-quality protein and less than 1 gram of sugar, you'll feel like you're cheating, but you're not. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use the code SHR10 to save 10% off your purchase of tasty pastries. Now available in cookies and cream, red velvet cake, birthday cake, blueberry, strawberry, brown sugar cinnamon, and hot fudge sundae. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary and use code SHR10 today. Never before has a product been so appropriately named as Botanic Tonics Feel Free. This plant-based elixir combines a variety of different effective compounds, all from raw plant materials that at different doses provide you with completely different experiences. A third of a bottle puts you in the zone and makes you very focused and is ideal for a non-stimulating pre-workout. It also has a mild analgesic effect for us older lifters who have soreness and little pains and aches that keep us from training as ferociously as we want. A half a bottle will create a mild euphoric effect that will allow you to forego consuming alcohol but still be socially lubricated and have fun. I have never had a product deliver on its name the way Botanic Tonics Feel Free does, and I won't ever be without it, and you shouldn't either. Go to shrnetwork.biz/feel-free and use the code SHR40 for 40% off your first order. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. There are lots of concerns about food supply today. That's why you need White Oak Pastures. White Oak Pastures will deliver food right to your doorstep. You don't even have to go out and be disappointed by shopping in grocery stores. The finest beef, pork, lamb, duck, and more can be found at White Oak Pastures. And now they even have seafood. And best of all, White Oak Pastures has a negative carbon footprint, which means that you don't have to feel guilty for eating your ribeye. Go to shrnetwork.biz/white oak and use the code SUPERHUMAN to save 15% off.
Move over, superheroes. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Welcome back. Oh, look, we've changed places. Okay. It's on top now. Okay. So I've done over 3,000 shows, and most of them are long format, 1 hour and a half, 2 hours, and so on. And we've done a lot of shows on hormones, and I'm going to call it a hormone, oxytocin, but it really isn't a hormone; it's a protein peptide. And we know that hormones influence gut microbial diversity. So, for instance, when oxytocin is present regularly, the gut tends to have a higher degree of L. reuteri. And then there's the discussion of chicken and egg. If supplementing with L. reuteri will actually influence oxytocin levels. So we know that there's this bidirectional work having that. So do we see gender differences in these types of conditions? And if we do we see women's guts change dramatically post-menopause? Who wants to grab that one?
I'll let Eytan from a more clinical standpoint, but yes,
Yeah.
it's exciting.
So it's a fascinating question, and hormones are a very important part of sex-related differences, and I think they do play a role here through the microbiome, and there has been some research on that. But generally, looking at epidemiology, the numbers are not hugely different, but there is also an age-dependent sex difference. So as a pediatric gastroenterologist, I see more boys than girls, mostly in the pre-adolescent years. But once they reach puberty, then the numbers become a lot more similar between boys and girls. And then later on in life for IBD, the differences are not huge. I'm not an expert in adult IBD, but I do know that certainly the biology or the features of disease do change in elderly, and some of that is sex related. And like there's a huge interest now in microbiome of the elderly and looking at longevity related to that. But I don't think there's been enough work connecting that directly to a specific disease like IBD. There has been more in other conditions such as diabetes and metabolic syndrome. But maybe Heather can speak a little bit more to other immune-mediated conditions, which we think, and she's now, so just to kind of explain the relationship here. Heather was my postdoc for 5 years, but for over a year now, she's had her own lab, and we have ongoing research on this topic specifically, but she's now exploring new directions with other immune-mediated conditions where I think sex differences are, sorry, that was my pager. Just ignore that. But other sex-mediated differences have been better described. So maybe you'll speak a little bit about that, Heather.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in this last year, we've really started expanding out to look at diseases like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and different cancers, which well, kind of correlated to inflammatory bowel disease. These are autoimmune conditions, and they do have similarities, while they, of course, have clear differences. But MS is a great example because MS actually affects majority women. And so as an autoimmune disease, it's amazing just to see some of the links when it comes to different hormonal features or genetic features, but also with the microbiome. So I think some of these diseases, there has kind of been a lack of focus on the microbiome to date compared to something like inflammatory bowel disease, where the gut is kind of the overarching attention hub. But because the gut isn't necessarily quite as well linked to diseases like MS and arthritis and these more systemic diseases, the focus hasn't yet quite been on the gut microbiota. It's something that's really starting to kick off now. But you do see very clear differences between patients who have these diseases and don't when it comes to their microbiome. And then within those diseases, IBD included, when you look at the microbiome of patients who are male or female, you see significant differences, and that change in the microbiota has been shown to have an effect on host immunity, disease outcomes, disease severity in a number of these diseases. So it's really interesting, but it's something that's kind of more recent or still not fully understood.
And specifically in our study, our numbers were not big enough to show that difference, but we did, I think when we do have bigger numbers, then that's certainly something that we're very interested in. And actually, we're obligated by all funding agencies. We're in Canada, but I know it's the same in the States, for really good reason to look at the impact of sex, which I think has been neglected for many decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did you discover any patterns? Did you discover any patterns that you can talk about where people should pay attention to certain fiber types? Like Craig Hollander, I'm going to put his whole comment up in a moment, but he says carrots consist of a fiber that creates peristalsis, which, for those who don't know, peristalsis is this the process of the gut moving things along. I think it happens every 1.5 hours or something like that, and it actually speeds it up, which may make some bad fibers move faster and not do as much damage. Did you find any patterns that we can talk about where people can pay attention to their own body?
So, I mean, IBD being the focus, these beta-fructan fibers were kind of the key fiber to pop out of this entire story. We did look at a number of different fibers, and we found that arabinoxylans and beta-fructans, which includes inulin and fructooligosaccharides, those were the fibers that could be pro-inflammatory and damage-inducing if they're not broken down. And on a systemic standpoint, so beyond IBD and the gut and what happens directly in the gut, if those fibers aren't being broken down, you're also not producing those anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids that should be taken up into the blood and cause these beneficial effects throughout the body. So it's two separate parts to that story happening. Is if you have the remaining fibers, those fibers can cause damage in the gut in a very specific setting, like Eytan mentioned. But on the other hand, if you're also not producing short-chain fatty acids thanks to these microbes, then you're also not getting the systemic beneficial effects of that fermentation process. So it was the beta-fructans and the arabinoxylans that we found that could have this inflammatory effect if they're not fermented. We did also find that beta-glucans, which you so kindly brought up already, so beta-glucans are typically found in your grain products, can cause barrier degrading effects, which can obviously have a variety of effects on gas, bloating, liquid release into the intestinal tract if they're also not being broken down. And I think that it's something that my team is really interested in focusing on as we're moving forward here, because from that standpoint, we do know that there are a lot of people who come back with these negative celiac disease tests. However, they're obviously expressing to us that they feel better if they're not consuming these grain products. So we're trying to understand, okay, well, if it's not a response to gluten and they don't have celiac disease, what is it? Could it possibly actually be, again, a change in their microbiome, the inability to break down these beta-glucans, and then in turn these beta-glucans causing this mild damage to the intestinal barriers. So there are a variety of different fibers that have either negative impacts or positive impacts. Just to put a positive touch on this entire situation, the pectin fibers, which you would typically find in different fruits, those fibers we found were actually quite beneficial. So these pectin fibers, even if they're not fermented, and again, we're not the first to show this, Dr. Wallace McNaught out of the University of Calgary has also done some work with pectin fibers and a variety of others around the world. But these can have beneficial effects on the gut barrier. They can also have beneficial effects with the microbiome. So one of the coolest studies that I've read yet to date is if you look at fecal microbial transplant and really trying to understand how we can make that new microbiota colony stick in the gut for a longer period of time, this particular study introduced an FMT, a microbial culture, into the body of their patients, and they at the same time introduced these pectin fibers. And those pectin fibers were actually really helpful at maintaining the culture of those new microbes in the gut for a longer period of time. So there's some really, really interesting work going on where we're really trying to pair this prebiotic and probiotic, both the microbes and the food that they need, to try to understand how you can promote improved gut health.
So there's a fascination with. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Sorry, I love what Heather said. I'm going to jump in and add 2 quick points. So first of all, I think that we have to again recognize the limitations of our study. So a lot of what we did at the mechanistic level was not in humans. So this was not an interventional study, right? We did not give them different diets, but we did take the biopsies and study them in a lab in an ex vivo model. Or, we took cell models and other in vitro models that we are able to do where we test these things. It's very difficult, as we discussed before, to do this prospectively in humans, but we are now setting up a study where we are going to try and see what type of fiber intervention will work for each individual. So we have to be cautious about interpreting what we're saying.
Absolutely.
And I still think, unfortunately, that some of the best advice I can give to anyone is watch what you're eating. And if it doesn't make you feel good, then maybe you should have less of it. But there is a danger that then you'll be avoiding things that,
So there's a fascination that sprouted from this notion that metformin is an anti-aging drug, which I've been opposed. I've said, and I've been ridiculed by many people, I've said that metformin only helps the metabolically broken. If you're healthy, taking it is not going to make you live longer. In fact, disrupting mTOR in any fashion as you get older is going to lead to some form of sarcopenia, and old people die from frailty, and you don't want to promote frailty, blah, blah, blah. And finally, what I've been saying all along is coming out in the literature. But one of the things that came out of the metformin is the proliferation of Akkermansia, this particular microbe. And now we have Akkermansia supplements. Everybody's crazy about Akkermansia. And I can tell you that I actually gave myself small intestinal bacterial overgrowth because, like most Americans, I believe more is better. And so I was taking VSL number 3, which is a by prescription, but over the counter, it's 1 billion CFUs, and I guess it's 2 billion CFUs by prescription. So I just doubled up. And I took it, and I ended up with a problem, and I had to take a antibiotic that's prescribed for 48 days that got rid of it. I actually interviewed the scientist who published the study before I did it. I'm very selfish about the topics I cover sometimes. But anyway, long way around. Can we seed the gut? Once we realize that the relationship between this microbe and this fiber giving us trouble, can we seed the gut with that fiber? And also, more importantly, to alter the immune response, can we build that mucosal barrier back into the gut by taking things like gluten or raw egg, So can we seed the gut with the microbes we're missing that will make good use of that fiber? And can we do something that will kind of plaster that raw spot in our intestines where it's too permeable?
Maybe I'll jump on part of that, and then Heather, I'm sure you'll have more to add. But so if we're looking at a specific condition, and the one that we're interested in is IBD, we have to recognize that you have to create the best conditions for success for whatever treatment it is. And I'm a true believer that diet has a major part in that. But at the same time, a lot of the medications that we use that mostly will suppress or alter the immune response when you have an active, really it's an autoimmune condition where our immune system is attacking our bowel. It's a bit different from other autoimmune conditions, but that's what it is. we do need to quiet things down and allow for repair, allow that barrier to rebuild itself. But at the same time,
Right.
there are more, natural ways, such as some of the fibers that Heather described, that do have a direct impact on the barrier, and some of the things that you discussed as well, Carl, that can help promote that. And I think that's where modern medicine is lacking. So we know a lot more about how to turn things off and bring down put the fire out, but not as much about rebuild. And that's where a lot of the emphasis needs to be. And we are still at early stages. And I think that anything I say right now, it really is not based on direct research. It's more extrapolation of what we think, and it's mostly speculative.
Right.
And certainly, a lot of the lessons that we're learning over the years, I think, will be applied, but we really need a more direct way of testing that. And that's where the opportunities are, but still, the gaps that need to be filled.
And I think that is kind of the important thing to remember here is if you've got an individual who's otherwise healthy and maybe just has a minor shift in the microbiota, it's quite easy to introduce certain dietary factors to promote growth of the correct microbes. But if you have a house on fire situation where there's honestly just such a toxic microenvironment present in the gut, the microbes have completely, small intestinal overgrowth being an example of this, where it's all the wrong microbes, far too many microbes, way too angry microbes, then introducing diet just isn't enough on its own. But yes, introducing diet at the same time as particular therapies may be able to provide the benefit that we're looking for. And like I even mentioned, introducing the correct microbes, but introducing them at the same time as different dietary factors can improve the body's ability to uptake those new microbes and allow them to survive in that environment, which obviously has benefits on improving the environment as well. So it's a very personalized situation.
I want to ask this question, and we're going to take a last break. And when we come back, I want to put Craig Hollander's comment up there, and we can take a look at it. What's the difference between IBS and IBD?
So yeah, that comes up a lot. I'm glad you asked that. So IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. IBD is inflammatory bowel diseases. And in the name, the biggest difference is irritable versus inflammatory, and disease versus syndrome. So in IBD, there is, in order to define it that way, there needs to be inflammation. And inflammation is typically best documented on endoscopy. Colonoscopy is usually what we'll do. And there we will see the impact of inflammation, and then the biopsies will actually show the inflammatory cells there. Whereas in IBS, you do not have that inflammation. Although I have to say that, there is some research suggesting that some of this may be subclinical, so not at the level that we can detect, but there are other changes there. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. IBD specifically is divided into Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which are quite well-defined conditions. It is more severe as far as the impact that it can have. So a lot of these patients have quite severe symptoms. Those with IBS can as well. We typically consider IBS as more of a functional disorder, where it's the motility, the nerve sensitivity that will be driving the symptoms around that. But in IBS, a lot of the focus is on treating the symptoms and identifying the triggers and changing whether it's food. There are some medications that will work on some of the nerve pathways, whereas in IBD, it's the inflammation that we're targeting. And typically that's with drugs. Diet has an impact on that as well. But this is a brief answer to a very complicated question. But certainly quite often we have confusion around that.
I want to take a last commercial break. I have a couple more questions. I want to put Craig Hollander's comment up here. I haven't read it entirely, so I don't know if it's a question or just a comment. So stay with us. We're going to take one last commercial break. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. There have been no real breakthroughs in resistance training for over 200 years. Whether it's pulleys or free weight, they all depend on gravity and the angles associated with gravity's effect directly on the weight. All of that has changed with the ARX machine. ARX stands for adaptive resistance. The ARX machine uses a 25 horsepower motor. You are literally fighting against a 25 horsepower motor, so every single rep is your 1 rep maximum at that moment in time. But ARX leverages another technique that has been known to produce rapid muscle gains and strength, and that is it leverages the eccentric or negative portion of the rep, which completely blows every other exercise and resistance training product out of the water. Go to shrnetwork.biz/ARX and discover the future of resistance training. Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform that connects customers with partnered providers from the comfort of your home. Merrick provides concierge service with your very own patient care provider as your health advocate. You'll go over all your needs and goals from improving sexual function, hair loss prevention, increased muscle, fat loss, and overall improved performance. Prescribed treatment options can be ordered and shipped directly to you if you meet the requirements, all from the comfort of your home. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Merrick Health. That's MAREKHEALTH and order your comprehensives and get 10% off with code SHR. Don't forget to add the lab analysis to have results reviewed with potential over-the-counter supplements or treatment recommendations. That's shrnetwork.biz/Merrick Health and use code SHR at checkout. Or order your own desired labs with code SHR and get 10% off your first lab order. I would easily say that I am the hugest proponent you will ever meet to doing anything that will improve the quality of my sleep. And that's because sleep is linked to just about every metabolic disorder we see in our population today. One of the easiest things you can do to improve the quality of your sleep is to get a pillow that can be shaped into the exact form factor that allows you to get your best night's sleep. And that is MyPillow. I've been sleeping with MyPillow for a few years now, and I can tell you that when I have to travel and stay in hotels, I don't get a good night's sleep because I don't have MyPillow with me. Right now, you can save up to 60% off of everything offered to improve the quality of your sleep at shrnetwork.biz/MyPillow when you use the code SHR. Or you can call toll-free 800-889-4938. And remember to use code SHR to save up to 60% off of everything at their website.
Dogs should be powered by fat and protein, not carbs. That's why Visionary Pet makes low-carb, ketogenic dog food for dogs of all breeds and life stages. From kibble to freeze-dried and even low-carb treats, all Visionary Pet recipes are very low-carb, ketogenic, and made with 100% real meat protein. Shop now and use code SHR for 20% off your first order today. Your dog deserves the lifelong benefits of optimal nutrition. Make the switch to Visionary and see why smart dogs eat low carb.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where we use oxygen for the power of good.
Welcome back. Oh, look at that. We changed places. I did that to keep it interesting, you know. So are you familiar with a peptide called BPC 157, Body Protection Complex 157?
I'm not.
I inject it virtually daily. And among other things, it's a peptide produced in the gut. And it can be taken orally. I did a show with Adel Musa, a brilliant guy from Germany, about 7 years ago. It's a peptide that has profound effects on healing and shutting down inflammation of the gut. That's not why I take it. It also, as the name implies, body protection complex, does a multitude of things, including help recover from workouts, from grueling workouts. It depends on growth factors like IGF-1 and growth hormone to facilitate its effects on muscle, but in its native state, it has a profound effect on the gut. It also, that's enough. So, could this peptide hold some sort of obviously, it's going to be a hard question to answer if you've not heard of it before, but could this be a good therapeutic peptide for people who do have inflammatory bowel disease?
I mean, just in kind of giving it a quick click on PubMed here, it looks like most of what we're seeing is for pain. So arthritic pain, wound healing.
BPC 157? BPC 157 specifically? Yeah,
Yeah,
I would imagine.
the studies are popping up were VGFR2, which is involved in tumorigenesis and things like that. So, I mean, it seems like a number of people have started looking into it.
Yeah.
You know, I think
I don't expect. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, without knowing much about it, the complexity of biology is humbling again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you an example. You know, the newest group of drugs, or one of the newest group of drugs for IBD, are small molecules called JAK inhibitors, which interfere with a very basic biological pathway. That every cell has. So they do have some side effects, but they work, you know, quite well. And I was pretty amazed when this was even introduced as an option. The first conference I went to, and someone said, "Hey, you should use JAK inhibitors." I'm like, "You got to be crazy!" Like, that is one of the most basic aspects of fighting infection, and yet it works. So the best proof in science is trying something and seeing if it works. Not that I'm saying that you need to try this. That needs to be done. There are stages for clinical trials. So I since then have stopped trying to predict what will work one way or another. But, you know, I imagine that there will be more research into it, and certainly interesting.
Two peptides that I would lightly urge you to look into in this realm of study. And one of them is BPC 157, specifically for the gut, those studies. The other one is thymosin alpha 1, which is a thymus gland peptide, because it's a powerful immune modulator without stopping the immune system from working. And people use thymosin alpha 1 as a therapy for Hashimoto, other autoimmune disorder, and so those are two very interesting ones that I think that may have application. Let me put this comment up. One, I'm gonna find it now. Here it is. So Craig Hollander says, I'm going to try to read this slowly. The fiber in carrots accelerates peristalsis and increases transit speed through the bowel, which therefore gives less time for endotoxins and bacteria to feed and grow. After helping to disinfect the small intestine, the fiber, was it disinfect? Yeah. The fiber then stimulates the large intestine to absorb excess estrogen, toxins, and stress hormones in the process by preventing the absorption of excess estrogen and serotonin, histamine, and other endotoxins in the intestines. It then allows the liver to be more effective. Okay, so it was just a comment, I guess, his finding. Endotoxins, I mean, food is endotoxic. I mean, every food has a capacity to, I remember reading a study many years ago, carbohydrates are the most toxic of all of the foods. Fat, the least, and followed by protein. So really, theoretically, everything we eat, our immune system has learned to deal with. And that's probably, so really everything is endotoxic, isn't it? To some degree or another.
Well, endotoxin is a very specific molecule, so otherwise known as LPS. So it's found in the bacterial wall. But the whole idea of, you know, food being toxic is certainly true. Like there's all this potential, but we have evolved in a way where we have the right barrier, we have antimicrobial peptides, we have different neutralizing techniques. Everything funnels into the liver from the gut, which is our big toxicology lab, which is able to then, you know, neutralize and secrete a lot of these toxins. So I think, you know, as long as you have an adjusted body overall, then most toxins, to a limit, you should manage, right? There are some bacterial infections that will produce large amounts of toxin that we just can't, our defenses aren't good enough against, and then everyone will get sick, right? But Otherwise, it depends on many different host factors. And, like if you create artificial conditions where you cause damage to the bowel and then you introduce the food, it might be toxic in that
Right.
setting, but it shouldn't under normal
Right.
conditions.
And it's also really important to recognize, so these endotoxins are from microbes, but obviously when you're bringing in fruits, vegetables, grains, things like that, any kind of food source really, you are also having microbes that grow in soil. The microbes grow on the outsides of these fruits, vegetables, everything like that. So another reason why it's quite important to wash your foods before you consume them too, because you can introduce microbes from your external environment when you're actually eating things.
One other thing I just wanted to mention, that there are oligosaccharides in human breast milk, and they're not for the baby. They keep the microbes in the breast milk alive. That's food for the journey until the baby can take those microbes in. I think that's fascinating because it shows. I've studied breast milk because I feel the secrets to the perfect human diet are in human breast milk, because through evolution, breast milk is everything that baby needs to sustain its journey into life. But the other thing is, it tells us that that these fibers are important to us. Oligosaccharides are a type of fiber, but not necessarily for the baby, but for the microbes in the breast milk, which is exactly what we're talking about. These fibers aren't, well, you slow your digestion down and bring your blood sugar down. That's not what it is. It's to feed those microbes in your gut that have beneficial effects on your biology. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, they're very neat. They're your HMOs, right? So your human milk oligosaccharides, which are kind of different to the fructo oligosaccharides that we've been talking about. But there is a lot of really interesting work being done in Canada in particular on these HMOs, the likes of Megan Azard and Marie-Claire Arietta, working on these types of fibers. But they're really interesting because they are quite different, but also in that level of infancy at a very, very young age, our microbiota is very different to what it ends up being in our teen years and then in adulthood. So our microbes, as they grow and fluctuate and become the more mature form of the microbiome, require very different types and sources of fibers. But I completely agree, those HMOs that come from human breast milk are really, really important when it comes to establishing that early microbiome that will then establish your health throughout the rest of your life.
Well, and your environment is delivered into a baby not by the breast milk, but the areola. About 70% of the microbial delivery from a mom is not from the milk; it's from her flesh, and her flesh is basically a representation, a microcosm of the microbes in the environment. When you think about it, you know what I mean? What she's coming in contact with, she washes, and what blouse she wore that day, and so it's very fascinating, and that's why I'm a little cautious now about probiotics. Oh, sorry about that. I'm very cautious about probiotics because we, as a culture, as soon as we learn about a new probiotic, we think, well, this is the new thing. This is what we're missing as we age. And we just start pounding this stuff down, and we really don't know anything. We're still at the flat Earth place when it comes to the microbes that inhabit our gut. And I'm convinced that microbes can't walk, and they can't reach for things and grab stuff they want to eat. And we call, we say, well, we're the host. Well, we're their vehicle is what it is, because I've changed my opinion. So LL37 is one of the human catalycidines. You were talking about, we have an antimicrobial system. By the way, I use that. I use a lot of different peptides at different times. But I had a friend, he's a former Navy SEAL, highly decorated, who, when he came home, he became a raging alcoholic. He was drinking like a liter of vodka a night. And I had a theory because of some other stuff. I've done research into LL37. I've done shows about it. And so, the hallmarks of true addiction are collateralization of neurons in the area of the brain that the compound stimulates. Those areas of the brain get denser and bigger, and they cause physical addiction. But I'm starting to realize that cravings start in the gut, and the way they work is these nasty little microbes who've become accustomed to you drinking alcohol every day start craving the alcohol. And I say that addiction, it's definitely stronger than just desire. And we eradicated whatever the microbes that were in his gut that were making him drink. He doesn't drink anymore. He just, once he started using the LL37, I had him, and look, I don't know what I'm talking about. You know, I didn't go to school for this, so I may be half full of shit. But what I had him do was drink alcohol while introducing the LL37, and then wean the alcohol off. And I learned this from the guy who came on and talked about SIBO. What they found out was if the people stopped eating the foods that caused them distress and they introduced the antibiotic, and I can't think of the name, it has a Xifaxan, they didn't have the results, and well, because the microbes spored and they stopped eating, so they couldn't eat the antibiotic. But when they kept eating the food that gave them distress, and most of it was gas and belching and stuff like that, but and they introduced the Xifaxan, they eradicated these microbes because they were eating what they loved while they were eating some of the Xifaxan. So I told them, I says, keep drinking for the first week, introduce the LL37 at a large dose, 250 micrograms a day, then stop drinking and back it down to 125 micrograms a day and finish out the month. And sure enough, it worked for him. Now, maybe it was placebo. Maybe he felt that using this peptide gave him magic power to overcome his addiction. But I've heard other people, since I talked about that on the show, who were alcoholics that said, I just lost the desire to drink. So I really do have a newfound respect for the microbes, going, hey, stop at Starbucks and get a cup of coffee for us. And, you're like, no, I don't want to drink coffee. But you have this urge and you follow the orders of the little bugs in your gut. It's really fascinating. There's so much more about our gut than we ever knew. And that's why I refrain from taking probiotics willy-nilly anymore, because they really do something to you,
Well, and it's really interesting because there was a study released quite recently showing that most of the probiotics that are available on the market, and even prebiotics, don't actually have any scientific evidence to back them and don't really do much of anything anyway. VSL3 is one that actually does have some scientific evidence to back its use. But I think it's kind of like you were alluding to here, is that without us understanding what a healthy microbiome actually is, it's really hard to actually point everyone in the right direction of which probiotic, which microbes would benefit them in their personal situation.
Yes.
And so the more we start to understand which microbes are important for what and in who, we'll start to develop a better understanding of how you can use things like probiotics in certain settings to help people through health outcomes or addiction or anything like that. But we really need to have a mechanistic understanding before we can point people in the right direction. And something that's really important to understand too is when you're orally taking some of these probiotics, if they don't have the right encapsulation to help them make it through the stomach, that stomach is a very acidic environment that most microbes can't survive. So if it is just a slurry of powdered microbes that you're shoving into your mouth, they're probably, even if they are still alive right now, they're probably not actually going to make it through the stomach to the location that you're supposed to be delivering them to,
right.
Which is why things like fecal microbial transplant, where you're actually providing the source through the rectum instead and not having to go through the stomach, can actually have a greater benefit.
Actually, fecal transplant saved my mom's life when she was in the nursing home. She got C. diff.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
She became very, very weak and very ill. And the physician there was open to, I talked to him. I says, what about fecal transplant? And I'm familiar with it. He says, but who are we going to use as a host? And my niece lived in, her granddaughter lived in Phoenix. and she was young and she was healthy, and she thought it was disgusting. Are they going to try to get it out of me? I says, no, you're going to poop in a little specimen cup and bring it to them. And they did. And literally in a day, she stopped with the diarrhea and she snapped out of it. So I've had some familiarity with it, and it works. Listen, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. I want to say that if many of my viewers and listeners are confused now, because I think that it's fair to say, pay attention to how you feel, and especially your bowel movements tell everything about if the diet works for you. But pay attention and try eliminating certain things. Maybe you're gassy all the time. It's something you're eating. It's not magic. It's not magic. Before you go buy a probiotic or something on Instagram that they're promoting as, this is going to heal your gut. It's funny. I just interviewed Dr. Irina and Michael Conboy. They are with the longevity lab at UC Berkeley. And they came on my show, and we were talking about plasmapheresis. Actually, I donate blood regularly because I believe that donating blood gets crap out of my body. But it seems that it's more important to donate plasma, because plasma has proteins in it that signal aging that you accumulate. So the goal is to turn plasma over, and you will start to see markers of aging, like biological age. The study that they did on plasmapheresis, they were also the ones that did process, where they took old rodents and young rodents and they switched their blood, and the young rodents got old and the old rodents got young. So I followed their work for a long time. But the interesting thing that probably no one caught in that interview is Irina said, you're never going to find something that you can take to keep you from aging. It's about what you remove that keeps you from aging. And the nuance there is, people are buying resveratrol and they're taking metformin and all these magic pills going to keep you. It's the things that you remove from your diet that will keep you aging well. So that's it. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Carl.
Having us.
Take care.
Take care. Have a good weekend. Have a good weekend. Don't forget, muscle is currency. So get into the gym and make a deposit today. We'll see everybody Monday with more Superhuman Radio.